Hello, and welcome to this Edison Open Forum Space 2022. My name's Vivienne Parry. I'm a science writer and broadcaster and your host for a fascinating panel discussion on the industrialization of space. Now, last year witnessed commercial human spaceflights, which took place more than 50 years after man first stepped on the moon. Such is the romance of space travel that I suspect many think that it's all that the space sector has been focused on. The reality is very different. A booming space economy has developed, predicted to potentially treble in size to more than $1 trillion by 2030. There are a vast array of potential investment opportunities. Not all of these are likely to be winners, but with satellite deployments increasing sharply and space-based data demand rising inexorably, those that do could deliver an exciting ride. And to tell us more, I'm joined by three guests who could not be better qualified to be our space guides. With me, Will Whitehorn, Chair of Seraphim Investment in Trust, President of the Space Trade Association UK Space. He's also on the board of AAC Clyde, and in a previous life was the first president of Virgin Galactic. We also have Dr. Graham Turnock, who until last year was CEO of the UK Space Agency and remains an advisor to the European Space Agency. And finally, Joanna Hart, Development Manager of the Harwell Space Cluster, which is an outpost, if I can put it like that, of UKRI and the Science and Technology Facilities Council. And all of you who are watching, do please put any questions that you have in the chat and we'll come to them as we go along. So welcome to all three of you. I'm so pleased that you're with us. And I want to start with a why now question so that we have a bit of a general overview. And perhaps we can start with you, Will. Why is the sector booming? What's driven this, great expansion of space industrialization, as we're calling it?
Quite simply, economics. Cheaply available space technology to put into space that can do a variety of things that wouldn't have been possible a decade ago, combined with much cheaper launch. So the cost of putting a satellite in space per kilo has fallen dramatically. And as a result, lots of people are doing lots more things up there. And that's come about really because of essentially the Commercialization of Space Amendment Act in the United States in 2004 that led to the development of companies like Virgin Orbit and Elon Musk's SpaceX. And they brought down the cost of launching satellites dramatically. And on top of that, AI enabled new technologies with new off-the-shelf available microchip-based systems, allowing you to do all sorts of things from using radar from space to identify objects on the ground, to tracking from space, being able to even track small Bluetooth objects, to be able to track from the ground to space. So a company like Leo Labs can now see objects up to 1,000 kilometers up, down to the size of a £1 or a €1 coin. It's a dramatic change, and that has led to an economic takeoff. In the past 3 years alone, the number of satellites in space has trebled. There are now 1,290 companies identified working in the UK in space. Space contributed about 6.9 billion to the British economy last year. And we're all, from the governments to the private sector to the military, spending more on space. And nothing could have highlighted the role of space more than the no hiding place that we've seen in the past few months, for example. So it really is a point of takeoff.
That's really illustrated, hasn't it? That there is no hiding place, as there were, as you say, that we get that real-time data. Graham, where do you see the main areas of space industrial activity or commercial activity?
So, I mean, what I would do is I'd add to Will's analysis that we are in the data economy. I think you went back to the 1950s and asked Dan Dare where he saw the opportunities for space. He probably talked to you about exploration and perhaps even space mining. I'm not sure he would have predicted the data economy that we live in today and what space can do for data. So you know, we all have smartphones. When I go out on my bicycle, I've got a little bicycle computer that uses GPS to tell me where I am. And really, I think that's where the big opportunities in space are at the moment, either communicating that information or generating it through Earth observation or helping people work out their position. So there's a huge area of smart applications using Earth observation, communications and satellite navigation technology that is on the move and expanding very rapidly. I mean, in addition to that, I think as we see the space economy itself develop, we will see things like tourism and potentially mining and you know, support activities that are needed to create a permanent moon base start to get moving. But at the moment, really, our need for space is driven by earthly requirements, and that is largely in the field of communications.
Joanna, first of all, tell me a little bit about the Harwell Space Cluster.
So at Harwell Space Cluster, we've got 100 space organisations which collectively employ about 1,400 people. So we've got some real space capability and expertise there. We've got significant test facilities, including the new National Satellite Test Facility. You'll be able to test satellites up to 7 tons or great constellations of small satellites. We've also got companies that are making kit to go into space. We've got companies that are using space data down here on Earth to address and make some of those solutions that Graham was just talking about. We've also got companies that are taking space capability to completely new markets. There was a spectrometer that was designed for space, designed to be shaken, taken up on a rocket. It's now being used to analyse heavy industrial processes. You wouldn't still say they were part of the space cluster, but it's that technology from that original investment that got there. And really the space cluster is about bringing all of that capability, all that knowledge, all that expertise, and highlighting it to the world, just how world leading we are, but also about how do we connect all the different people in and link those national supply chains.
I mean, I was astonished to discover that over 3,000 jobs in the UK had appeared in the last year alone, simply related to space industries.
Absolutely. Well, that comes from your question of why now. It's not just the technology that Will was talking about, it's that commercial opportunity that Graham was alluding to. There are now those new opportunities to come through. And we're also seeing a lot more investor interest, which is speeding everything up. So it's not just investment from government in contracts that they need. We've now got a lot more venture capitalists looking at it. And investment in the space sector is far more mainstream than it was when I first joined 8 years ago.
Now, Graham, can you help us a bit with just describing where this space activity takes place? Because we've got these low Earth orbits and geostationary orbits. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yes, well, essentially, there are sort of 3 types of orbit that people tend to talk about. There's low Earth orbit, and that tends to be at about 400 to 600. I mean, people do extend it a bit higher, but most of what goes on is in that range, 400 to 600 kilometers above the Earth. So, for example, the International Space Station is at that altitude, and that's a very good altitude, you know, if you want to observe the Earth, because obviously the closer you are to something, the easier that you can see it. It's also very good for the new range of communication satellites, such as Elon Musk Starlink or the OneWeb constellation, albeit that's a little bit higher, because again, it reduces the time lags in communication. You then go to the other end, which is geostationary, which is a very long way from the Earth, 30-odd thousand kilometers. And the reason why satellites sit in that orbit is because they appear to be stationary, as the name suggests, relative to a fixed point on the Earth. And therefore, they're really good for things like television broadcasting. So you can just point your aerial at a particular satellite, and the satellite won't appear to move because it's rotating with the same frequency as the Earth's own rotation around its axis. In the middle, you've got medium Earth orbit, and classically, the sorts of things that we see in medium Earth orbit are geo positioning satellite systems. So the US GPS system is there, as is the Russian GLONASS system. So largely, though, we're mainly talking about low Earth orbit and geostationary orbit.
And that's where we've seen the explosion of activity in the low Earth. Although I must stop talking about explosions in relation to space. There's been a lot of increased activity in the low Earth orbit. That's where we've got these constellations.
Absolutely, and that's where Elon Musk is putting his Starlink satellites up at about 400 kilometers, and he's putting thousands of them there. And we've just radically increased the number of satellites in orbit in the last couple of years.
And Will, to go back to your point about no hiding place, one of the big new areas for satellites and for the space economy is actually to do with sustainability and about managing our planet's resources because of this real-time data. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, in every sense, sustainability and the battle to try and limit climate change from atmospheric pollution and carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, satellites are in the forefront of it, and they're going to be in the forefront to an even greater extent, because you can now tell, for instance, from a satellite exactly which chimney of which factory in some part of Asia is producing CFCs illegally. You couldn't do that a few years ago. You were down to that level of preciseness. So as a policing mechanism for climate change, space is going to be absolutely crucial. In addition to that, when it comes to sustainability generally, in terms of monitoring the Earth much more effectively than we've ever been able to do from the ground, space is playing a huge role. It can now, using the kind of technologies that have been developed, using ground penetrating radar, using hyperspectral cameras, using new types of receivers, we can tell exactly what's going on at every layer of the atmosphere in real time. It's going to improve weather forecasting immensely, and it's also improving our ability to really understand what is happening in terms of the carbon content of the atmosphere, for example, and exactly what types of temperature change are happening in what layers of what parts of ocean and land at any one time. And it's only with this knowledge that we're going to have any chance of actually achieving any form of net zero. And furthermore, net zero itself, I think, will only be achievable from space, because the next phase of what can happen is actually putting the industrial activities that cause a lot of the problems on the planet, such as data centers, server farms, if you want to call them that, and putting solar power in space and allowing us to produce it 24/7 down to the planet's surface. These things are no longer science fiction. They're fact in that they can be done. It's going to be the economics that dictate how quickly.
I want to come to that theme about thinking about the difference between science fiction and science fact. But can we just talk a bit about regulation? Because space, I know we think it's infinite, but actually orbital space is finite. There are issues about space debris. We've seen a recent initiative from the World Economic Forum and European Space Agency for a space sustainability index. And it's an environment which is, by its very nature, is obviously global, not national, and we've seen some particular political concerns recently. So I don't know who wants to take that question about regulation.
It's never an easy one.
There's never an easy one. Graham, let's go to you.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to.
You'll have seen that there was a paper in Nature Astronomy very recently on this.
Exactly. So yes, you referred to the work that the European Space Policy Institute and ESA and others have been working on around a space sustainability index. I mean, you know, the old adage, you can't manage what you can't measure. And, you know, some form of index, you know, could clearly play a very useful role in determining how saturated, if you like, you know, orbits are becoming, and then guide people towards actions that could reduce that saturation. So, you know, if satellites are far better at avoiding potential collisions, then suddenly you've got more space to operate in the same orbit. So you're really looking for some kind of measure that can detect how many satellites are up there and how good they are at avoiding one another, and indeed avoiding the debris that's in place. I mean, you asked about regulation. I mean, clearly, you know, regulation is a good thing when it helps people behave in a coordinated and commonly understood way, such that everybody benefits. I mean, what we have to be careful of, obviously, is regulation that either is, you know, disproportionate and ineffective, or indeed a situation where some parts of the global space economy are free riding off the back of other people behaving well through applying regulatory standards that others don't follow. So there are quite a lot of tricky issues to work this through, but I think it's fairly clear that we can't continue with the very self-regulated approach that we currently have to operating in space that applies currently. It might have worked for a few thousand operational satellites, but it's not going to work for tens or even hundreds of thousands of operational satellites.
Joanna, you're nodding your head. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And I think the UK is really trying to take a lead in how we actually start to address some of these issues. Clearly, managing, understanding what space norms are, getting global agreement is really important. No one country can own space. So we've got to get that international agreement to be able to agree what the norms are, agree what is proportionate regulation, as Graham says. And then once we've got that, how do we actually deal with it? If there is space debris, how do we remove any potential debris? We've got a number of companies at Harwell Space Cluster, including Astroscale and Clear Space, that are looking at doing just that. So how can you, when you're in space, either take an old satellite out of its orbit so it's no longer in the way, or how can you take some sort of other debris that might be up there for any number of different reasons away from that? And I think the UK taking a lead on that regulation, working with organisations like the Secure World Foundation, and we'll see a conference on that in June, is really helping to set those norms and move that discussion forward. I think your point about why now at the very beginning is linked to all of this. Satellites, there's been this huge number more satellites than we've had before, and these issues just weren't thought about when those initial plans were put together. And now we've got to make sure that as we go forward, we have space as a much more sustainable environment.
So let's get to the nub of what investors want. What should they be looking for? How do they separate science fiction from science fact? I mean, a lot of this that is now commonplace and we think of as ordinary in terms of the space economy was indeed science fiction not so very long ago. So this is absolutely in your space, Will. What are you looking for when you see a company come to you?
A business plan that can be monetized. It's just like the earthbound economy. The only advantage space has in one major way is that there's very little depreciation in space, because your assets tend to work quite well as long as you can sustain them up there. Low Earth orbit satellites will eventually come back down, but can be replaced quickly. But if you look at actual equipment, I mean, look at the Voyagers. They've been going out beyond the solar system now, and they're still producing data and working. So you've got very different issues to deal with in terms of your assets and how long they can last and be used for. But what you are looking for is the same thing as you're looking for within the planet's atmosphere. You're looking for customers. Can they get customers for what they're going to produce? Is the data that they're going to produce in demand? Is the data they're going to produce valuable to governments? Then, when you go beyond data, is the service they're going to provide, such as Starlink or OneWeb's broadband, is that going to be in demand? Well, I can tell you, where I live in Sussex, I can't wait to get it, because we can't get more than 4 meg where we live. So I think there will be big demand around the planet, especially in places that are less developed, for satellites that can produce a good broadband solution. And then you move on from that. We were looking at a business plan recently for a company that can actually convert your ordinary mobile phone using its constellation of satellites into a global satellite phone wherever you are on the planet for a very small premium on your normal monthly bill. Or at a company that, for instance, can Bluetooth tag with incredibly cheap, penny costing Bluetooth tags, can Bluetooth anything you want, any piece of equipment for logistics, and you can track it, not having to use the GPS system. This is an even simpler system, which will allow mass tracking for organizations and companies that need to know the logistics of what they're doing in the world. And then on the climate change front, not only there is demand for data and business plans around how you can provide the policing of that data, but also on top of that, the new services from space that I was talking about earlier. It's not science fiction to think if a data center is going to cost a lot more to operate in the planet's atmosphere because it produces heat and carbon dioxide pollution, and is based in an area which still uses oil-fired power stations, you can put that data center in space where it can access unlimited solar-powered, incredibly high efficiency. And you can get it up there using one of these new, very large rockets where you can build an array, or you can build the things we're talking about using a Starlink, a Starliner type large heavy lift vehicle, the type that Elon is about to start producing, or the new NASA vehicles, or the new Ariane space vehicles. If you can get very high amounts of payload into space at these lower costs, you can almost do anything industrial up there. For instance, one of the areas that I've been looking at is the pharmaceutical industry, where there is a latent demand due to the research they've already done on the ISS for the idea that they can combine molecules in space to create new drugs and new ways of treating disease, because the molecules can be combined up there in zero gravity in a way that cannot be done on the planet's surface and can't be artificially replicated. So there is a huge plethora of industries, and if you can produce business plans to satisfy them in a way that they can satisfy their customers, be those customers government, military, or fully commercial services of the type we talked about, then you are going to have a viable space economy, and it's already here, so we know it's going to be viable.
And it seems to me you've got a whole range of customers there. It's not just, you say, government and big business, which you'd kind of expect, but, you know, many smaller businesses, and who knows, I mean, not only, of course, broadband consumers, but who knows, Bluetooth, can it spot my lost specs from space? Might be hugely helpful.
Yes, is the answer. This is going to be possible within the next 2 years.
Fantastic. We've got a good question here, which perhaps is one for Graham. How soon do you see the space transportation system being robust and secure enough for industrial manufacturing processes to be developed in space?
Well, I think we're very close to that already. I mean, there's relatively few failures these days. I mean, Ariane's failed a couple of times in well over 100 launches. So as long as you have a backup plan, then, you know, especially when you're not talking about carrying humans, talking about carrying, you know, cargo, then, you know, a 1%, 2% loss, which I've no doubt will reduce even further, you know, would hopefully not be death to anybody's business plan. And indeed, as you start to look at things like constellations, they're really built with the potential for sort of losses of satellites in mind, because there are so many individual components, so many satellites. If you lose a few, as indeed SpaceX did recently, actually as a result of a solar storm, they lost 30 or 40 satellites that got sort of pushed back down again as they were trying to raise themselves into orbit. If you lose a few, it's not at the end of the world. So I don't think we need to sort of worry too much, my view, about the reliability of space transportation. I mean, of course, you know, with Elon Musk, and he rightly celebrates failure, you know, everyone tends to focus on the fact that he still hasn't got, you know, a Starship up into orbit yet, but I'm sure he'll do it. And he'll do it in a way that is, you know, very, you know, very secure. I've no doubt about it. So yeah, I don't think people should be put off by transportation risks.
Joanna, anything you have to add to that?
Well, I think it's not just about the transportation and getting things up there, because obviously we can put 3D printers in space effectively. So actually you can build an awful lot of kit or bigger kit from smaller bits of kit in space. So we can actually do things in a more efficient way. And then when we're there, the improvements in robotics, enabling the things to be actually be made in space, built in space, sort of ratcheted together or whatever else in space. And so this whole business model is changing significantly. And that's why people can start to think about space-based energy or solar power and energy initiatives, because you can actually start to do far bigger, larger scale things in space that you're not just taking up in one particular satellite or one particular rocket. So that's where the dynamics will change. And we've got lots of companies working in this area, particularly at Harwell Space Cluster, but across the UK and beyond, all trying to develop that capability in stages, demonstrate it in stages. And I guess that goes back to Will's point. There's partly about the customer. It's partly about being able to demonstrate what you're doing can actually work, can actually deliver, and having a really clear roadmap as to how you see those companies developing and reaching those milestones will be really important as we go on this journey.
Now, you talked about a roadmap. What kind of timescales are we thinking of? Because I guess in the past, a lot of this stuff we've been thinking of timescales of decades, but what's the timescales now? Joanna, first of all, you.
I think we're going to start to see this sort of 2030, 2040. It's you know, it's in. I will still be alive. I'll put it that way. And I think we will start to see those things coming through. Small scale demos to start with. We're not going to have cities in the sky, you know, before 2050 plus, but we might start to see the sort of initial stages, see some of those initial building blocks going through. And I think what's really good at the moment about a lot of these really big initiatives is they're getting people thinking big, thinking differently, pulling on capability from different sectors, because space can't do everything. We can learn so much from other industries. When it comes to robotics, there's been a lot of learning over from the nuclear sector where you have to do remote handling. That also means there's a flip side. We can take some of the learnings that we have in the space sector back to other sectors. And we've seen companies like Reaction Engines talking or moving some of their technology into other sectors as well. So that can also help really deliver on those business plans that Will was talking about. But sometimes you don't quite know what those are going to be and what those spin-offs are going to be. And that's why these really big projects can be good to get companies thinking in a slightly different way.
And Will, it's must be the only sector where Hollywood is ahead of you. That, you know, you talk to people about space mining, and people say to you, "Well, isn't Bruce Willis already doing that?" They think it's somehow out there already, and that all this stuff must be inherently very risky. But actually, how risky is it? And how can an investment trust like Seraphim help out in de-risking?
Well, you make a very good point about what people perceive, because about half of the world perceives that we're already doing the things in space that we haven't started doing yet, and the other half perceives that we've actually never even been to the moon, and that was all done in a set in Hollywood. But the reality is that we've done exactly what we have done, which is we've got human beings into space, we've got technology into space, we've done proper science in space, and we are exploring space well beyond our own solar system, and we are exploring it in depth inside our solar system. But what the reality is that we can now do the things that really were quite difficult before to do, because we've got, as I said earlier, we've got the ability to get that kit into space. And as Joanna said earlier, getting kit into space these days doesn't mean to say you have to prefab it on Earth like we had to do with the International Space Station. We can now take up what we need to build with, take it up there, have the solar power in place, have AI robotics in place, have things like 3D printers in space, and we can start to build out. We can actually take, for instance, the spacecraft we take the kit up in and use that as the materials to build out what we need to build. So I am very confident that companies like Seraphim, there'll be more of us soon. I mean, Seraphim's currently the only investment trust in the world, publicly quoted investment trust investing in the space industry. And I'm sure there will be more of them soon, because we can see the other end of the business plans that we've invested in. Joanna mentioned one company that we've invested in, Astroscale. There are lots of others like D-Orbit. There was Leo Labs, the company I mentioned earlier, that managed to spot the Russian satellite being blown apart by a Russian missile last October. There are literally dozens and dozens of new companies that we've invested in that are showing promise in their business plans already. And to those, an exponentially larger number are going to be added over the next 5 years. So I'm convinced that for space investment, the future is bright. If we're getting a return from it, that's the important thing. If you're prepared to think relatively long term, and a lot of the money going in is relatively long term, then you are going to get a return from this stuff, because these services are becoming essential. We already couldn't feed the population of this planet without space. We simply couldn't do it. Without those agricultural, those weather satellites, those other GPS-based enablers, we couldn't produce the level of food we're doing, and we certainly couldn't track it around the globe and keep it fresh. So we're already saving ourselves by being in space, and I think space is going to save humanity. And if we can, you know, as the old adage says, if you can make a buck on the way there, it's going to help that process to happen.
How are the space agencies and the commercial companies allied in all of this? Is there alignment?
Well, certainly within Europe, there's a very strong alignment because European space effort for a very long time has been very substantially about supporting our economy and helping the space sector in Europe, you know, grow and gain a, you know, substantial part of the world's space economy. And the Americans have been a little bit more focused on exploration and science, and Europe's always been very strongly focused on technology. So, for example, in Europe, we're very strong on communication satellites. It's one of the very big programs in the European Space Agency's set of programs. The UK is a very strong player in that. We invest £300 million a year into the, sorry, not a year, over a 4-year cycle into the European Space Agency's ARTES program, which is all about communications. So I think, you know, companies really are extremely well supported in Europe. That said, we can always do better. As we've talked, you know, there's a much greater expectation of getting your technology to market over a shorter period of time. Typically, we tended to spend, you know, 5 to 10 years plus getting everything absolutely right before we've been ready to take it to market. That won't work anymore. The model is much more about sort of testing things as you go. So there's a bit of adaptation required amongst the space agencies in getting onto that that way of thinking. But we are very commercial in Europe, and there's a lot of help available, both through national space agencies such as the UK Space Agency, but also through the European Space Agency with the programs that it runs.
And Joanna, when a company with a great idea comes to you, what are you looking for at Harwell? What makes you want to take them into your fold?
Well, we're open to anyone. So if they want to come and locate there, we will help them as much as we possibly can. In terms of, you know, what are we looking for? It's exciting stories, companies that are finding niches that are going to allow them to do something that other people aren't doing. I guess that's one thing we didn't touch on earlier, is understanding that competitive environment and where have they got something that's a little bit different. And I think, you know, when we're talking about that for satellites, historically, we've been very blinkered and just looked at the space sector. But now there's so much integration between terrestrial capability and satellite capability. How do you add the positioning that you get from satellites to some sort of application for understanding your crops? How do you put all of those pieces together? And the more that we're understanding that, the more that that's increasing those opportunities and linking those pieces. So when I find companies, it's the ones that are doing something that's quite innovative, that really sort of sets them apart for the rest of the competition, and ones that are thinking quite laterally. How do they dock into not just the sort of usual satellite customers, which historically has been government and defence, but how can they actually dock into some of those commercial customers? Because that's often where those business models are. And I think we haven't really touched very much on defence, but clearly we have seen the benefits of satellites for defence, and it clearly is a very core customer. And I think most of the companies that I'm working with now are looking at how can they have dual use capability? How can what they're doing be used both for the civil side, but also defence as well? And how can things translate from one to the other? I've got a company, Oxford Space Systems. They make antennas for satellites, but actually they could use those as land receivers as well. So how can you take some of that technology and move it across? And there's lots of opportunities there. And the companies that are really thinking creatively are the most exciting ones to work with.
So when somebody comes to you and says, we're thinking about putting these nets up into space to get some debris, you don't go, stop it, don't darken my door. You just say, come on in. We'd really like to talk about this.
Yeah, well, I think you've got to talk about it. You've got to understand. I mean, I'm really lucky because if companies are coming up with a totally crazy idea, organisations like Seraphim, UK Space Agency won't fund. So I can be as open to anything as I want, and then the company is not going to go much further if it hasn't got a really solid business idea that a venture capitalist or a space agency would consider funding. So I let them do the checks and balances, and I just like to welcome and see those ideas. But perhaps when they do come with the net idea, I might just suggest a few other ideas that could be used. I mean, there was one very great sort of space debris mission where we had a harpoon in space. So, you know, there's all sorts of options.
So we've got a few questions still to come, but and I want to finish up when we've taken some questions with asking you what the most exciting things that are coming to you at the moment are. So here's some questions. Where does Amazon Kyper stand with its satellite constellation? When should we expect Kyper to finalize the specs to launch the request for proposal to suppliers, and when they're likely to start their first satellite launch into low Earth orbit? It seems SpaceX Starlink is taking the entire market as first mover. Will, a brief answer from you on that one.
Right. First of all, I don't think Starlink will take the entire market, because I think OneWeb, despite its setback with the Soyuz launch, I think OneWeb actually has a very, very good business plan. They have very good spectrum, good technology, and they could easily be a winner, OneWeb. And Starlink will be a winner, and I think there's room for another one. But we don't know much about Kyper. The thing about Amazon is they have a history of being very secretive until the thing actually gets near to fruition. They did that certainly with the Blue Origin project for suborbital space launch. And the fact that was there was no human guidance in that rocket, it was using AI to launch. They kept a lot of that very quiet, and they've done the same with Kyper. It may be that Graham or Joanna know more about it than I do, but I suspect we're all pretty much in the dark on their precise plan. All we know is they're spending a lot of money on it.
As Amazon do. This is one for you, Graham, perhaps. OneWeb plans to transition to its second generation satellites, including optical inter-satellite communications. When do we expect OneWeb to be ready to start phase 2 of its constellation? Who at OneWeb is in the driver's seat, the Indian shareholder or the UK government?
So, well, I mean, the great success of OneWeb is that it hasn't just been the Indians and the UK. We brought on several additional investors over the last couple of years, which I think is, you know, shows great confidence in the business plan. The UK have retained a special type of share, which means that it's in a very strong position to keep that second generation manufacturing and as much of the related activity as possible in the UK. At the moment, OneWeb are obviously focused on getting the first generation fully deployed, because that way they can prove their service. But I know that they're keen to start thinking about the second generation as soon as they possibly can. The first generation is a fairly basic system, and you've talked about the inter-satellite optical links. And I know they've got lots of other things that they want to factor into the second generation. And as Will says, there's a lot of competition out there, so they really know that they need to sort of keep raising their game to remain competitive. But they're in a great position. They've got very good spectrum, and they've got into the market, you know, early on, obviously with SpaceX as a major competitor, but ahead of Kyper. So I think we can look forward to the second generation. As to when it will be precisely, I think that probably is something that you'll have to look to the analysts' reports on OneWeb to get a closer fix on. But I know they're working hard on it.
But it's not going to be like James Webb with its telescope with its ever lengthening delay.
Not.
Will, briefly.
One point is worth making. It's a very simplistic one, but there is a truth in it. It takes Starlink several thousand satellites to do something that OneWeb can do with several hundred. And there's economics in that for the long term. Interesting.
Here's another one for you, Will, and again, briefly, if you would. What are the key technology IP building blocks of a successful space operation? This is a top question. Whoever you asked it is a top question. And how much value added will ultimately be concentrated in the hands of a very few primes? Will Europe be able to effectively compete with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman? If yes, is there any alternative to Airbus? Big question.
That's a highly complex question. I actually think there's very little IP going to be concentrated in any primes. I think the IP across all the different services available in space is developing so rapidly. No one has a monopoly on space launch. No one has a monopoly on satellite design. No one has a monopoly on the tech that's inside satellites. There's lots of very small companies, still independent, with lots of very good proprietary IP. So I do not think we're looking at a world where there'll be an oligopoly of big space companies in Europe or America or the Far East. I actually think this is going to be a truly global economy. And it is only going to be, obviously, the national interest defense side, which may well put a dampener on some of that, because of the ITAR regulations operating in the United States and the CFIUS regulations operating in the United States. So I think that I would be optimistic that this is going to be a very deep, generalized type of economy with many thousands and thousands of players.
This is one that I know Joanna can't answer because we're in a period of purdah. We're putting a lot of money into the European space project. The EU hasn't got a great record of collaboration with the UK. Not so sure about that. How confident can we be that they'll not just expel us once we've paid in our share of money and they've picked our brains, Graham?
Well, I think we have got you know, an open door potentially to join Copernicus. It's a little bit challenging in that it has been linked to the Northern Ireland negotiations, and they themselves have now taken a bit of a back seat, unfortunately, because of the Ukraine situation. So, you know, but I think there is a recognition the UK has, you know, great strength, certainly in Earth observation, and the European Union does want the UK to be part of that program. That said, you know, we're now in a negotiation, an ongoing negotiation with the European Union, and we need to have our fallbacks and our own alternatives if we're to play an effective role in the periodic negotiations that we would need to have with them. So I think it's entirely sensible for us to be thinking about what we might do if we weren't part of Copernicus in the future. So, you know, we'll just have to work with them and see how things pan out. And obviously, you know, there is going to be a period of transition. We've been through this Brexit period, which has been, you know, quite a sort of, you know, sticky one. There's not been a lot of trust going around in large quantities, and I think we need to, you know, be very streetwise, but just see how things go for 2 or 3 years, and we will have several years before we come to the next Copernicus negotiation. You know, should we enter Copernicus on this occasion?
Joanna, something I know you can talk about is just briefly tell us about the solar energy from space initiative in the UK, because that's very interesting.
So this is being a large number of organisations are involved in it. The Satellite Applications Catapult, which is headquartered at Harwell Space Cluster, has been one of the key leaders, and they've brought together a whole range of different companies that are starting to break down the challenge that is space-based energy. You know, what can it actually do? What do you need? What do you need here on Earth? What's the different pieces of the infrastructure? And starting to say, well, okay, how do we start to develop the different strands of that? And so some of the greatest minds are all starting to come together. And it's not just in the UK, internationally, people are looking at this as well. And so it's just how do we start to address those different bits? And with such a range of interesting companies and innovation, I think we're going to find that those problems get addressed quite quickly. And I think that really goes back to your point, or the question about the IP piece, is that whole sort of supply chain. Yes, there are going to be a number of big primes, but what I'm seeing is a lot of those primes looking to work with the innovative small companies, because many of those primes just can't generate that innovation in the same way. Their processes are much more staid. They can't just, you know, breadboard something on a Friday afternoon, see whether it works and take it on. And so I think what we're trying to see, and what everybody's working towards, is a really good supply chain where you have those innovative companies linking all the way through to some of the primes that have got the ability to bring all of that capability, because lots of SMEs are just not going to be able to do everything. They're going to have to come together. And so there are roles for integrators as part of that, and then feeding into the primes.
Now we're coming to our close. I wanted to give you all an opportunity to tell us what the most exciting application that you've seen recently, that you have really got just that schoolboy excitement or schoolgirl excitement about, that you think, wow. And that might happen in, say, 10 to 15 years. Let's start with you, Will.
That's I mean, I have seen so many recently. It's been so exciting. I mean, everything from the things we discussed earlier. But I think of all of them, I think the thing that could be a real breakthrough is solar power from space. Yeah. And I could see us being able to do it within a decade. And that's really exciting. Personally, the most exciting thing for me is I'm actually going to space later this year. So
are you?
I'm looking forward to that very much, yes. I finally got my ticket from when I ran Virgin Galactic originally. So hopefully they're going to start flying properly in about 6 months' time. So
and are you excited by that, Will? Yes. Graham, how about you? What really excites you?
So, I mean, Will's already mentioned solar power, which would certainly be up in my top sort of 3 to 5. One other I'd mention is quantum key distribution. So, you know, we're all aware of how challenging it is to operate in the cyber world, how at risk we are to hackers. And, you know, one of the ways to defend yourself is through encrypting your communications, but even encrypted communications are at risk now of quantum computers breaking those keys. The way around that is potentially through quantum key distribution, which can't be intercepted and can't be broken, or at least you can refresh the keys sufficiently frequently. They can't be. And by delivering those from space, you can overcome the problems that arise for quantum key distribution on the ground, which is that those photons that are disentangled can only survive over a sort of period of multiple tens or potentially hundreds of kilometers, which in itself creates problems. So quantum key distribution via space really has the opportunity to help us have a very secure world of communications, which we just wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
It's an area Seraphim's invested in fact, as well.
Yeah. Joanna, how about you?
So I think for me, the thing that always really excites me is when somebody gives you an idea and you think, oh, I wonder why somebody hadn't thought of that before, or are you sure that's not already there? Because that almost always means that there's a really good opportunity there. But I think the key thing for me, I'm working with 100 space organisations at Harwell Space Cluster, is those organisations aren't just ideas. They're not just people sat at their kitchen table coming up with their first business plan. There are actually sort of 20 to 50 people companies. They are going to be the companies that many people on this call will be investing in the future. And I think we're at a really exciting time because those companies have got those ideas, they're off or they're out of the garage, they're starting to really develop them, they're getting funding by venture capitalists. And in the not too distant future, organisations are going to be really investing them and taking them on to the next level. And we'll see a whole range, be that to do with data or satellite applications down here on Earth and using that space data, or be that new technology that's going into space. We're really going to see that coming through.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I just think it's been brilliant. I mean, I do lots of things, as you all know, if you watch Edison Open Forum regularly, about all sorts of different subjects. This is the one that really excites me. I mean, my background is in medicine, but actually this is the thing I've been reporting on for the last 25 years, 30 years, and suddenly it's all happening. It's so exciting. It's a really investable area. And I'm delighted that you've been able to share your insights with us. So if you're watching and you'd like more information, just go along to Edison and they'll be happy to help you. And of course, we've done several more in-depth interviews with 6 companies already in the space economy. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.